You're watching The Legal Breakdown. This is our second video covering day 1 of Donald Trump's first criminal trial in New York. Glenn, I gotta ask, first before we get into the meat of day 1, what's your reaction to Donald Trump falling asleep in the courtroom? You know what, Brian? Not a good look when a defendant, who is sort of fighting for his life, albeit figuratively speaking, fighting to remain a viable candidate for the presidency, fighting to potentially stay out of prison, isn't interested enough to stay awake on day 1 of his trial. There was reporting from Maggie Haberman and others that multiple times, the head went down, the jaw went slack and he was out. In fact, a note was being passed to Donald Trump by his lawyer, and he wasn't even taking it because he was out, and then I guess the head reeled back one time, and he caught himself after he'd fallen asleep. Not a good, you would think you would have enough interest in what was going on that you might want to stay awake, you might want to pay attention, you might even want to participate in your defense, but not Donald Trump. So now let me say, having litigated some very lengthy trials, I have seen all sorts of people fall asleep in the courtroom. I've seen jurors fall asleep, at which point the judge has to sort of gently say to the jury, might this be a good time for a break? So everybody kind of wakes back up. So it's not that unusual, but the defendant falling asleep, it let me just relate this story that just occurred to me. We have kind of a saying anytime somebody is being interrogated, a custodial interrogation, after they are taken into custody, the detectives or the agents, or the investigators will be going out and going at them, and then they'll take a break and they'll walk out. But the video recording keeps rolling, so you can see the defendant sitting in the room. An innocent person who's being interrogated will be awake, will be alert, will be bouncing off the walls, but a guilty person, when they get that minute to take a break in the interrogation, will fall asleep every time. I don't know if that's what's at play here, but it was notable that Donald Trump couldn't keep his eyes, and just quick, and before we dive into the rest of day 1, just two things on the political perspective to this point. The first is that Trump is predicated his entire re-election campaign on this idea that his opponent, Joe Biden, is sleepy. And yet, while Joe Biden is crisscrossing the country, and dealing with international crises in Russia and Ukraine and also the Middle East, you've got Donald Trump, who can't even stay awake during his own criminal trial, which one might think would be a pretty momentous occasion if it was happening to anybody else. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if he can't stay awake during his own criminal trial, is this guy gonna be able to be awake at 300 in the morning if he needs to go into the Situation Room? If he gonna be awake if a natural disaster wreaks havoc on an American town or city somewhere in this country, and he has to respond to it immediately? This doesn't bode well for the guy who's running for a job where you can't be nodding off somewhere just because you're bored. All right, yeah, I think Trump really did one up Joe Biden when he's always referring to him as Sleepy Joe. We now have, drowsy defendant Donald, which I think is really a far more serious concern. The man is on trial for his freedom, and he can't stay awake. Come on now, perfectly put. All right, Glenn, so let's dive into some surprising news from the courtroom here. Judgment, Sean asked the pool of 96 prospective jurors to self-identify if they should be excused, if they don't think they could be fair and impartial. Of those 95, about 50 of them raised their hands, and they were then excused. What's your reaction to that? My reaction is, you probably have 50 honest jurors, who said I have such strong feelings one way or the other about Donald Trump, and what he's done, that I just don't think I can be fair. And you know what? Those are the people we want to self-select and be dismissed, right? We want fair and impartial jurors, people who themselves deep down, subjectively believe they can be fair and impartial. Maybe they're not terribly political, maybe they're not terribly plugged into what Donald Trump has done, maybe they don't have strong feelings, one way or another. I know it's kind of hard for us to understand that, given what we the people have been subjected to at the hands of Donald Trump the last 6, 7, 8 years, and yet there are people out there like this. It's a really interesting choice for Judge Marchand, however, to let jurors self-select and opt out. Why is it interesting? Because, Brian, there are a lot of people who just don't want to be bothered with jury service. We've probably heard the joke that I would never want to be judged by 12 people who aren't smart enough to get out of jury service. A lot of people in my experience, and I picked a lot of juries, will try to come up with BS reasons why they can't serve, because they just don't want to be there. I think what Judge Marchand did, though letting people completely opt out, and go unquestioned in their assertion that they want to opt out, that they can't be fair and impartial, I think it was the right call. Why do I say that? Ordinarily, that's not the way it happens if somebody wants to opt out. You know what we almost always do? We question that jury. We asked, well, why is it that you think you can't be fair and impartial? Some people might say, you know what? I've had really bad experiences with the police, or with a prosecutor, or with the judge, and I don't think I can be fair. Or I've had a really bad experience with the defense attorney and I don't think I can be fair. And we will question that person to see whether there may be overstating the case, whether they can be fair. Let me just use one example, which I think is a really important illustration of this principle. How we ordinarily try to rehabilitate a juror who thinks maybe they can't be fair. I did a lot of murder cases and a lot of murder-driven RICO cases of violent crime organizations, and sometimes jurors would say, you know what, Judge? I don't think I can be fair in this murder case, because the murder was committed with a firearm. That's the information that the judge gives to the jurors up front. The judge will put the jurors on notice of the nature of the case, and I have such strong feelings about firearms either one way or another. But let's assume that juror says, I am so against firearms that I can't sit fairly as a juror in a case if it involves a firearm, if it's a shooting death. We would try to rehabilitate that juror, and we might not be successful. Here's what I would say to that. I would say, sir, so are you saying that if the prosecution's case didn't prove the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, you might vote guilty anyway, because you heard evidence about a firearm, and you really don't like firearms? You know what most jurors would say in response to that, Brian? They'd say, yeah, I never thought about it that way. No, I guess I could be fair, even though I really don't like guns. That's called rehabilitating the juror. We try to do it, as long as we can, get the juror to a place where they honestly believe, and we honestly believe they can be fair, even though they have these aversions, or these preferences. Judge Marchand said, I'm not going to do that. Why? Because it would probably waste lots and lots of time, trying to rehabilitate people who really can't be fair when it comes to Donald Trump, for one reason or another. But it does make it seem like, the jury selection is going to be an uphill slog. They called for 96 jurors on day 150, self-selected out. It's going to take some time to impanel 12 jurors, and I think 5 or 6 alternates. Glenn, I want to read a quote that Adam Klasfeld posted on Twitter, and this is from a juror quote. I feel that nobody's above the law, whether it's a former president, a sitting president, or a janitor. Is a quote like that grounds for disqualification from a juror? Like, and as a follow-up to that, what does it say? If it is grounds for disqualification, an answer like that, Brian, is grounds to qualify a juror. We can never come to a place in this country where a member of the community is called for jury service, and they say, I believe in the rule of law. I believe everybody should be treated fairly and equally under the rule of law, regardless of their station or status in life. That qualifies a juror. It doesn't disqualify a juror, and I can promise you, there is no way Judge Mershon would grant a defense motion to kick that juror off. It's called a challenge for cause. You get an unlimited number of challenges for cause, as the defense attorney and as the prosecutor, because if there is cause to kick somebody off, then they should be kicked off after you've exercised all of your challenges for cause, because you think a juror has said something that indicates they can't be fair. Then you move on to the next step, and that is what are called peremptory challenges. Each side gets 10 challenges and they can kick off anybody. So for example, that conversation we just had about that, jurors answer that, I believe the law applies equally to presidents, former presidents, and janitors. The defense attorney might say, well, I can't really challenge that person for cow